Okay, so post-release, when we had audio coders, one of the things which we thought had the most potential for being improved over the base game was the sound of crowds and the Walla. In the base game, this was implemented the same way as a standard ambient sound, so it became a 2D sound when you were within the ambient zone. And what we wanted was a greater feeling of immersion, so that as you moved through a crowd of people, you would have the feeling that the sound was also moving around you. As you turned, the sound would turn around you. If you had more NPCs on one side of you, you would hear more sound from them. I'm going to play you a short demo of the solution that we came up with for this. If I have a mouse pointer. Okay, now in the room today, actually, I think we only have a mono sound system, so you're not going to hear the full effect of this work that we put into producing sound. And if you're watching the recording, it will be in stereo, but hopefully you can hear something of what's going on. I'll see if I can rewind this video and we can talk a little bit about what we can see here. So we have this bit of debug information down the bottom here, and what you're seeing is we split the world, or the dimensions of the world, let's say, into 4 directions. We place a sound each direction, and then we test the NPCs which are within the ambient zone that is containing the Walla to see which one of these quadrants they're going to fall in. We can then pass this through as a parameter for the total number of NPCs within a quadrant. We have an average distance of NPCs from the listener within the quadrant. As the NPCs get closer, there is some bleed through, so that if you're coming close to a small number of NPCs, you still feel surrounded and it's not going to jump from side to side. We track whether they're inside or outside, so if you're standing next to a pub, you're not going to hear a crowd of people as if they're outside. And also we track the state of the NPC, so whether they're afraid or not afraid. So if something shocking happens, a monster appears, or someone's being attacked and the NPCs become scared and run away, you won't have this calm, happy sound of Walla. Instead, we can change to a more scared sound, and actually we also have a sweetener. As you pass a threshold, if you pass this threshold suddenly, then we'll add an extra sound onto that. We also had a few extra features, and this perhaps demonstrates the way that we were able to work rapidly with the sound designers to provide custom solutions. One of them on volume triggers was to provide gate triggers. So in the original, very flexible tools, we often had situations, particularly at say the mouth of a cave, where we would want to start an event when crossing a line and stop an event when coming back across this line. And the original way to do this was to place 2 zones. One zone has the start event, and the second zone has the stop event. But this can be a little risky. It's possible for the events to come through in the wrong order if something funny happens when crossing the border between these zones. And so for the post-release content, we added gate triggers where a single zone could model this functionality. Another thing we added was a distance parameter, and this is available obviously by default in the newer versions of Wwise, but in the version that we shipped with, it wasn't a possibility. So another example of how it's a small thing, but it can add a lot, and by having dedicated audio programs, we were able to quickly add this in. A further feature that we added, not in time to have an effect on the full implementation of the zones for blood and wine, but we were able to use it a bit, was automatic volume generation for trees and river. So this comes back to the idea that we have this very big world, and it's very labor intensive to populate this with ambient zones. And particularly when sometimes the shape of the world can change, or the map can change, and then all of these zones have to be redone. So we wanted to provide some support for the sound designers in this respect. And I'll play you a short video showing this in action. So you can see we draw one big area over the trees, we hit a button with some settings, and now we have areas that are surrounding all of these smaller copses of trees. And there are parameters which can be tuned. You could have it so that we would surround this entire group of trees with a single zone, or any amount in between. And we were able to use it in a few places, so it did come in handy, even if we weren't able to apply it everywhere. Okay, so once we've created this living, breathing world, we obviously need to fill it with gameplay, because we have a game. And we're going to come back to the same approach in the initial game, where very hands-on for the sound designers, lots of manual tagging. Most of the sounds for the gameplay are tagged manually on anim and VFX timelines, so they have to be hand-placed. Again, giving us a very handcrafted feel, very labor-intensive. One notable exception is the physical collisions, which obviously are generated procedurally by the code. We would then pass through switches for context and parameters for control, and Krzysiek will talk a little bit more detail about this, particularly for combat. And in terms of how our code was structured, we really had two general paradigms for our approach to game objects. The first is a simple one-shot emitter for something like a footstep, where we just want to fire and forget it. And the second is for more complex situations, characters, monsters, where perhaps we want to play sounds from different parts of the entity, and so we would have game objects for the bones, which would be created as they were needed, as well as modeling more complicated behavior, persistent sounds, parameters changing over time, this kind of thing. So we can look a little bit at the timeline editing that we have. So we're going to jump straight down to the CX'd anim sound event. We have the sound event name, and this is something that can be selected from a list of all of the events that are available from Wwise. So the sound designer doesn't have to remember the name that they need to type in there. It can just be selected. A max distance, this is a performance thing, obviously fairly basic but very effective. If a sound is too far away, we just don't want to send the event to Wwise at all. We can select a bone for the anim event to be triggered on. We can select a number of switches, so these are the things that we want to apply a context for. And again, this can be chosen from a list of possible switches that are available. And similarly, we don't have any parameters here, but we can choose from a list of parameters. The filter, because we have so many sounds tagged on anims and such a reliance on that, there are situations sometimes where the anim blending code would provide us with more events than we really wanted. Say we have two anims playing two similar anims which are blending, and ideally we will only get the single sound event from that, but sometimes not so much. And so we have a capacity to control that from our side as well. And the use distance parameter, I mentioned earlier, we had it on the ambience. We also had it as an option for the anim events, not set by default, because this was done in a slightly more custom way by code. It has its own space. And then the speed and decel distance, I'll talk about this in a moment. So post-release, we didn't make any, again, big sweeping changes to the way that we were implementing the SFX, but we were able to add a few nice touches. One of them was detecting long grass and plants. So even in the base game, we had a situation where if you walk through some long grass or some tall plants, they would move out of the way of the player, Geralt or Ciri. However, we had no way of detecting this for sounds. There was no way to respond. In Blood and Wine, we do have this ability by dynamically creating a map around the player of the points where procedural grass is being generated. It wasn't 100%, it was perhaps 60% accurate. There were some things that we just weren't able to find a hook for to include in this map, but the effect is still quite strong. We also had several monsters in Blood and Wine that had the ability to teleport. And one issue that we had with this was if a monster started creating a sound, a screech or the sound of an attack, and then teleported, this sound would jump with them. It would follow the game object, which wasn't particularly satisfactory in terms of the sound there. So we added the ability with the, we saw previously with the speed and the decel distance, to create auxiliary sound anim events. And what this meant was that when we set a speed on an anim event, instead of being played on the main game object, it would be played on an additional one that was targeted towards that bone, and would then follow that bone at the speed, and as it got past a certain distance would slow down. So when we had teleports that would vary in distance, we had no way of knowing in advance how far a teleport would be. We still had some control to have this effect without it becoming very slow and ending up following the monster around for a long time. Similarly, we had a monster that spat projectiles at the player, and we wanted some extra sound when this projectile was incoming. So on the effects timeline, we had the option to create a latch event. As the projectile gets to a certain distance, we'll play this sweetener. And another situation was in some scenes where the camera was changing a lot, the sound effects could be quite distracting. For example, this would happen with torches. If you have a torch burning nearby and the camera changes, then you hear it switching rapidly between sides. And our way to solve this was to have a listener override. This could be placed on a sound emitter, one of the point emitters, or it could be placed on a character. And in the end, I think we mostly settled on having Geralt had his a default listener override on him that could be targeted from any scene.